Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Sultans and Sneakers. I'm your host, as always, Maheen the podcaster. And on today's show, I am honored to be joined in my home by Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, who's visiting from Istanbul, Turkey. Dr. Yakoob, assalamu alaikum and welcome to Chicago.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, how are you liking Chicago so far?
I love the pizza you just had.
Yeah.
I'm having a great time. People have taken care of me and so forth. It's the first time I've come to Chicago in my life, so it's an amazing experience. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, you know, we had the Lou Manati's, the Lou. It's one of the few pizza places. Sometimes pizza places will default to signature pizza being like a sausage.
Right.
But theirs is actually a vegetarian signature. So, yeah, we I think there's like one slice left, so.
Yeah, mashallah, it's amazing.
You know, alhamdulillah, it's good. Well, before I start, I want to give a shout out to Sheikh Hamza Maqbul, my friend and teacher who facilitated this podcast. And he's the one that essentially brought you here to Chicago.
That's right, yeah.
You know, he saw the value in, he sent a message, I want to say earlier this week to a WhatsApp thread that I'm on. And, I originally wasn't intending on coming, because of some other commitments I had this weekend.
Right.
But, you know, Sheikh Hamza is sometimes able to articulate things in a certain way. And, you know, you can't say no. And, you know, and it's, as someone who frequents like Islamic conventions, it was just, you know, it got to me. And I was like, yeah, this seems like something that's actual substantive knowledge. And it definitely was a reinvigoration, I would think.
Oh, thank you very much. See, because I never know how these things go.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you said that.
I think the important, even yesterday, it's almost you did a great job of priming us for the class. Like, why are we studying this?
Right.
Because sometimes a historian might just jump into like, with their dates.
That's right.
And just start reading off the book. So, but to get started, you know, I've heard you on other podcasts and you've talked about a little bit about in passing your upbringing in England, working class family. Your father is of Indian descent or Pakistani?
Yeah, Indian descent from Uganda.
Uganda.
Yeah.
And your mother's from Pakistan.
That's right.
And, you know, you're mentioning, this idea of being from a working class background. And you were working in retail and you never thought in a million years you'd end up in academia because you hate reading and all this stuff. So tell us a little, because, you know, you alluded to, being, and I'll use football. I'm talking like, you know, I think y'all had it first.
Yep.
So I think y'all got on the name.
I appreciate that.
You know, you played football growing up.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I was just a regular kid playing football.
Right.
Minding my own business and failing through school.
Failing. Yeah, failing.
Yeah. You know, my mum and dad got divorced when I was young, a single parent household. Mm-hmm. They did the best that they could, but being an ethnic minority, we had challenges. And, you know, my mum was doing the best that she could to raise two kids and put food on the table.
Right.
My dad was there for me. I'm not going to say he wasn't. And, but it was a challenge. And at that time, the idea of being academically smart was unthinkable.
Right.
So for me, I was coasting through school, doing what I had to do. Didn't do really well. The disappointment was my mum reminds me now. She goes that when I was a child, I was a smart kid.
Right.
So what I take from this, and now growing up, looking at it, is that it's not about half the times when you're making it through university or college or whatnot. It's not the issue of necessarily intelligence. It's family backgrounds, choices, the opportunity of having a particular staple education when you're young, stability, and all of these sort of things, right?
Right.
So growing up, I've always known that I wasn't an idiot.
Right.
But I was just, you know, school wasn't a priority. The priority was just living life. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, when did you start getting serious about, because you said you worked in retail.
Yeah.
That was like any education, formal, like higher education?
I mean, when I was 16, I started working in retail.
Okay.
And, I mean, I got an undergraduate degree in business computing.
Okay.
So I did that. You know, my family still felt the need that I had to go to university. So I did university. Mm. But it was after I did my undergrads, and then I was working. I did various retail jobs, and then I couldn't find a degree-related job. Mm-hmm. I finally found one. I was working for Capgemini. I was a desktop tester. Mm-hmm. I hated it. I hated it. I was making money for the first time in my life. And
Right.
coming from that type of background, that was success. But
Desktop test. You were like testing people's like desktops for the consultants.
So what you basically have is if you have a series of computers at an office,
Right.
and they all have the software on the same office, right?
Right.
So they use a pack. I can't believe I still remember this. But you have, rather than having an independent like software on each single machine,
Right.
you would have one package for all the machines that are
Right.
licensed together, right?
Right.
And then what happens is that when you put another application on that machine,
Right.
it can mess up the previous application because you have to make adjustments to it.
Right.
So I would test this
Right.
to see if it's working or not, if it's correlating or not. And I remember sitting on a cubicle this big, literally,
Right.
not allowed to speak to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you did speak to people, but that wasn't encouraged, and just plowing away. And that, it was happening at a time where I was transitioning in the sense of becoming more and more compliant in regards to praying Salah 5 times a day.
Okay.
And so what was happening was, on the one hand, I was finally...
And what was driving that? Your religiosity?
I mean, just like most people at our age, I met brothers in the university during my undergrads.
Okay.
And university it is a turning moment for many of us
Right.
In England. But I still needed, I don't know, I needed more. I mean, I felt a sense of, I wasn't authentic in the way that I understood my Islam. So I was still struggling with this idea that, okay, on the one hand, I went to a Quran school, I learned Quran, and I spent time with people of all different denominations and so forth. But I keep saying it in this trip here, I felt a sense of a dislocation regarding Islam. I couldn't make sense of I tried to fit in terms of trying to be English. Mm-hmm. That did not work. I mean, I did everything that everyone else did. Alhamdulillah, in those days, I didn't drink alcohol or do any of those things. Mm. But, I mean, I watched football. I spent time with people who were not interested in Islam. Yeah. And whatnot. It just, I wasn't being accepted. So the very thing that you're desiring to be a part of, and you get this facade where you're made to believe that you are an equal citizen and so forth. But then you really feel that no matter how hard I'm trying, I'm still not being accepted here. Right. And then when you go home, so when my mum took me to Pakistan, for example, I was the British guy. So that was a challenge. But what was consistent during those moments was people kept reminding me that I'm Muslim. I used to go pray Jummah. And I really was a spiritual kid, and I wanted to be closer to Islam. I just didn't know how to get it. We had institutions. Yeah. They were just forming in those days. There was a lot of people in the community who were great in many ways, helping us coast through it. But I think it wasn't their fault. They couldn't understand that sort of like challenge that we were going through. And so I was looking for something else.
I'm going to ask this as an ignorant American, but I've heard in passing, because I've never been to the UK. Yeah. But I've heard that the white British English folks will use Paki as a derogatory slur.
Yeah. So this is no word of a joke, but when George Bush said that, I remember listening to him saying, "We're going to get the Pakis and the Indians together." Yeah. I was just thinking, what is he saying? Right. Because in England, I mean, it might not sound like it's a derogatory term in that sense, because people say, all it means is clean, but it's the intent that came with it. Okay. So we didn't coin that term. That was a term coined by racists who would use that term towards us as a way of telling us that you don't belong here. So that was a problem with that term in that sense. This is why even when I was working in Jurassic Park, we were laughing when they called this dinosaur Pachyosaurus. And because it brings back particular imaginations and memories and so on. And that's some Muslims are from a Pakistani origin are trying to reclaim that word. I generally don't use it, even in the sense of trying to reclaim it. I mean, I'm using it now as a way of just expressing something, but I wouldn't use it amongst my fellow Pakistanis in that sense. But some do, because the street is a little bit different, and the way that you reclaim words are different, and I get it.
I have a friend that used to be, before he got into Islam, he actually was part of the hooligan culture, and he's Pakistani.
Right.
And then he said the other, like the white hooligans, would be like, "This is our Paki,"
right,
kind of thing.
Yeah, of course. And this is the interesting thing, when and that's what I mean. This idea of trying to get acceptance, and I'm not sure how it works in the US, but class is a huge thing in the UK, and race. Like when I was young, we wouldn't say we were English. We would say we were British. Whereas now, I guess more and more young Muslims are willing to identify with being English, meaning they're from England.
Yeah.
Because for those of your viewers who don't know, I mean, it's the United Kingdom, so Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland, sorry,
Right.
and England. But for us, growing up as ethnic minorities, being English meant you were white and English. It wasn't just that you were living in England. Now that's changed a little bit, I assume, for the younger generation. But for us, we couldn't make that connection. So we would say, I'm a British national, or I'm British. Actually, the way that we identify in England is I usually say I'm a Londoner. That's what I say.
Okay. So you more attribute yourself to your city.
Yeah, because that city has when you say that to Londoners, when you say I'm a Londoner, they just know what you're talking about.
Okay.
Which is this idea that it's a multi-ethnic cosmopolitan city and it's the big city.
Right.
And it is quite different than other parts of the country.
Right. So, are there slurs for other like South Asians, like Bangladeshis or Indians, or the Pakistanis in general tend to take the brunt of that?
No, I think that slur was used against everybody that was brown. They didn't. They didn't see us as from different denominations. They just saw us as all as one. Now, after 9/11, those slurs changed a little bit. They became what we would term as being Islamophobic slurs. What was even more interesting is when people converted to Islam, they were being called Pakis.
Right.
So there was a racialization of the Islamophobia.
I got you.
So there's an assumption, or there was an ingrained assumption by certain people who were racist, that Islam was the brown man's religion in the UK, right?
Sure.
So it was spoken of in those terms. And that's, I don't know, I mean, I'm assuming that's the difference. That is a difference, maybe.
The term I've heard in America is like camel jockey.
Okay. Wow.
Have you heard that in the UK?
No.
Yeah.
So,
So, and it's funny, the first time I heard that term was, I was with some guys, like, I wouldn't say they're high school friends, but acquaintances. And we had graduated, we were in college, but we were playing like fantasy baseball.
Right.
Like, so I remember I was like, I gotta give up on this league. So I had my one friend who was Muslim Bangladeshi in the league. So I kind of like dumped all my players and let him pick them up. Right. And then he banned us, and he basically, I was like, what happened? He's like, well, you and your camel jockey friend.
Oh, wow.
And you're like, whoa. Like,
okay.
I never heard that term before. In the retrospect, it's like,
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, we had different forms of discrimination. People would mock our names, wouldn't be able to say our names. And so it's quite funny because, now when I think about it, people still struggle to say my name, but can say Daenerys Targaryen. And you think, how does that happen?
Yeah.
So, but things are changing. I mean, I'm of a generation that was before 9/11.
Right.
And then after 9/11, things changed.
Sure.
And we sort of saw the shifting.
Yep.
Whereas the generation after me probably didn't realize the shifting was taking place.
Right.
They were in it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Sure. So, you talk about your religiosity started increasing. So then what next?
I booked a ticket. I booked a ticket to go to Damascus.
Oh, just like that?
Just like that.
How old were you at this time?
Good question. I must have been about 24, 25.
Okay. So you finished your undergrad. You're working in retail.
I was finished my undergrad, working in retail. I did retail for a while and then found this job at Capgemini.
Yep.
Hated it.
Right.
I remember coming home on a Wednesday.
Right.
He goes, oh, you sick? What happened? How come you come home? Because actually, my mum lived in London, and I used to travel 150 miles. I was living outside of London. So
that's where the job was.
That's where the job was. So
sure.
I'd usually come home on the weekend.
Oh, okay.
I came home on a Wednesday, and she goes, what happened? You sick? I said, well, sort of. She says, what do you mean? I said, I quit my job. And she goes, did you find another one? I said, no. She goes, well, what are you doing? I said, well, I've applied for this TEFL course to teach English.
Yeah.
That's for a month, and then I'm going to Damascus. And she just looked at me in absolute disbelief. Absolute disbelief. Like, are you crazy? I can understand how she felt. It was difficult for me because, like, even growing up, becoming religious, at the time, I became a bit of a scattergun.
Yeah.
So I was really harsh on my family.
So your parents would you say their religiosity was nominal?
They were traditional Muslims.
Okay.
And they sent me to madrasa and all of these things, but I don't think they had that expectation that I would practice my religiosity so stringently at that moment of my life.
Yeah.
My mum wanted a clean-shaven kid, get married to somebody from Pakistan and live
Right.
happily ever after.
Right.
Instead, I'm going through this crisis and saying I need to learn more about Deen.
Right.
I need to know Arabic.
Mhm.
And she's going, "What are you doing? You just join a course here." I said, "It's not that straightforward." And so, you're abandoning your job. What are you doing? This is
Right.
crazy.
Right.
And I can sort of understand her fears in terms of thinking that was crazy now, looking back at it. If I was my mother.
Probably because you have a track record of not really accomplishing much.
Yeah.
It's different, I think, maybe if a kid is like super ambitious
Yeah.
and just changes his direction. You think that's the thing?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that could be a reason, but I think the other reason was that, what job am I going to get out of this? I'm doing this for Deen.
Right.
It's not like I'm changing a career path by saying, I wanted to be a doctor, but now I want to do political scientist.
Right.
This is like, I'm going to study Arabic and become a better Muslim. I need to learn more. And it's just like sheer disbelief. Like,
right.
Are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
So my dad was easygoing. He was just like, all right, fine. Because when I was a kid, Tablighi Jamaat used to take me places. So he just like, oh, you're becoming Tablighi? And I was like, no, man, I'm just, Dad, come on. And I don't think he quite grasped what I was trying to do as well. Right. So there was a sense of a disconnect. And that's a generational disconnect for sure. My sister got it. My sister got it because we're just close. And I think that she had seen me struggling with myself at home. And, and she had realized that, and actually when I was started reading more about Islam, she could see that I really got it. I was smart. So
right, because you mentioned, like I think we said earlier that you don't like reading. Mm. So, but this is like when you're reading stuff about Islam, you were kind of hooked into a little bit. You say that?
Oh, yes and no.
Yeah.
So reading comes hard to me.
Okay.
When my students always laugh now, and I tell them that I get anxiety if I walk into a library. Mm. If I go into a book, I got many friends now who are scholars in either traditional scholars or academics. We go into bookshops together, and I say, "Can I just sit down?" And they can't believe it because for them it's a goldmine. They're picking up these books, those books. That reading was just not a thing that I enjoyed. I was a great listener. I liked listening. Mm-hmm. But what I learned when I started to learn is I have to do this. It's just like when somebody goes to the gym, right?
Right.
It's like, listen, you're going to have to put in the effort if you want to be good at something. So I was piling in the effort, trying to really, because it really did matter to me in terms of like, I wanted to be a good Muslim, whatever that meant at the time, right? And I was a human sponge. If there was a talk, wherever it was, whoever it was, whatever they belonged to, I didn't care. I just wanted to know more. And whatever books were available, I would just read it.
Do you remember any speakers that you were attracted to?
No, it was across the board.
Across the board. No one specific that you like, oh, this guy is it, and then I'm going to latch on to him?
No.
It wasn't like that.
We didn't have that type of scene in England. In England, there was various different groups and peoples that existed. So HD had the Khilafah conference in the 90s, which was huge.
Right.
We had a lot of Salafi dawah that was happening. We had a lot of, I went to a mosque where it was predominantly Tablighi Jamaat and so forth.
Right.
So one of the things that you notice in London in particular is that everybody exists of all sorts. Speaker's Corner, for example.
I was going to say Speaker's Corner. Right?
Yeah. So I wasn't a type of guy that went to Speaker's Corner just because I didn't enjoy the polemics.
Yeah.
I didn't enjoy the debates and discussions. I was more interested in just learning about Islam.
Right.
What I actually took, though, was for the human experiences. There were people that put an arm around me. There were people that I would go to the masjid and they would sit down, have a cup of coffee and talk to me. Mm. And I think it was those human moments of people who took out their time to be an older brother, to be a friend, to be an uncle. Mm-hmm. And that is what's left a lasting impression on me, actually, than anything else in that sense. It's that human moments of those human people, which I have a lot of time for in terms of, and that's now how I try to do things.
So you try to give back in that way from what was done to you. Okay.
Totally. I think, I say this to my students all the time, that Rasul Sallam didn't necessarily feel the need to establish what we do today in terms of institutions. He invested in the Sahabi who he made institutions. He invested in people,
right? But
not just intellectually, spiritually, on a human level. He was there for them. He cried with them. He laughed with them. And when you see that type of culture being passed down,
Mm-hmm.
and that's important because you can feel like when, I don't know if this might sound strange to you, but sometimes when people are talking to you about Islam and it just feels like, you know, this is you're a person who's been checked on a list.
Right.
You know, you're smart enough to then realize that what's going on here. Whereas when somebody genuinely cares, when
Right.
someone sits down with you, puts an arm on your shoulder and goes,
Mm-hmm.
"How are you feeling today?" You know, I'm struggling. He goes, "Don't worry, I'll pray for you. Inshallah, you'll be okay."
Right.
Those small moments, which I feel like sometimes is missing.
Right.
Like we're all trying to do the big picture,
Yep.
which is important. I don't deny that, but the granular we sometimes forget. And this might sound harsh what I'm saying, but I feel like sometimes as a community we can lack a sense of emotional intelligence.
Mm.
And I think it's not. We are very heavy on being intelligent intellectually, but the emotional intelligence we still miss that. And maybe it's because I'm an empath, and maybe it's because I was failing that I started to notice the human value in people, and I understood my own struggle. That I didn't necessarily feel that education was a good marker of judging somebody as being important. What I felt and what I tried to be was a good human being, a good Muslim,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what got me through it.
Gotcha. So now, you mentioned you were studying for the TOEFL, which is to be able to teach English.
That's right.
In a Muslim land.
That's right.
Why Damascus? And this is 2004. I'm doing the math in my
pure
head.
chance.
Yeah.
So I was choosing. It was a toss of a coin between Damascus and Cairo.
Okay. You hear about Cairo a lot, right?
All the time. But in those days, like Damascus was also a thing. I'm assuming I heard it from someone, but I don't know why it was in my head. And I chose Damascus. I went to Syria, and the first time was tough. I struggled. It was a culture shock, and it wasn't the sort of utopia that I was imagining. And I'm a kid from a what we call it, Indo-Pak background, turns up to Damascus, thinking that everybody's an Arabic speaking, everyone's going to love me and so forth. No one rolls a red carpet out for you. So you then turn up and you say, okay, how am I going to navigate this space? I remember getting sick and just feeling like this is a mistake. And I remember my mother calling me. This is bizarre. She called me. She said, I had a dream that you're not well. Are you okay? I said, Alhamdulillah, I'm doing fine. Because I just couldn't come to terms with the idea that I'm struggling here. And she used to have this trick question, which is, don't you miss us? And if I say yes, then she'll say, come home. And if I said no, then they'll be like, shame on you, right? So I used to give her this answer, I've learned not to miss you. As a way of surviving it. And then gradually I started to make friends. And I was living with a group of guys who are here in New Jersey, actually. They were Uzbek Muslims from Saudi.
Oh, okay.
And
they were there also to learn Arabic?
No, they knew Arabic. They're from Saudi Arabia.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
But they were studying dentistry.
In Damascus.
In Damascus. Mm-hmm. And it was being taught in Arabic in those days.
Okay.
And I happened to move in with them because I needed that. I was alone, struggling.
Yep.
And just to have a sense of normality. And they were so human in their Islam. It wasn't ideology. It wasn't this group, that group. We're going to save the world. It was just, hey, I'm waking up for Salat al-Fajr. Do you want to do Jama'at? Yeah, sure, bro. Hey, listen, I'm cooking. What do you want to eat?
Yeah.
And it sounds weird, but those sort of moments, I needed that. Mm-hmm. You can get whatever you want from the books that are available to you.
Right.
You can fetishize over those.
Yeah.
But on a human level, to see Islam, and then gradually, when I got a job in Syria, when I finally got my job teaching English.
Right.
And then I was really interacting with society, and then people were great. They really took, and the joke was I was Yakoob, the British Pakistani, to just Yakoob. And that when that transition took place,
right,
the country changed for me, for sure.
So, and how long did you were you in Syria total? Like you did multiple trips? I did 2 trips. So the first trip was about a year and a bit, and then I came back a second time. I did 2 years. So 3.5 years total, roughly.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And the first trip was, like I said, tough and difficult. The second trip, I knew what to expect. It was a lot easy. Now, don't get me wrong. The country was a pressure cooker. not in terms of the people, but you felt like you were being watched and so forth. It was a difficult place to be.
Oh,
in
with
that
the
sense.
secret police and
Yeah,
things
that's
like
right. And I think I learned a lot about the complexities of the Muslim world living there. I didn't appreciate that when you're in England, you can just say what you want and get away with it. And then when you come to a country where the stakes are high, it's not that you may get into trouble, it's that people that you know may get into trouble via association.
Right.
And that sort of responsibility it hit me different. And then I remember coming back to England and just thinking to myself, you know what? People just really don't understand what's going on in that place. We project certain things, but the lived reality was different. But what I met, and I say this about both Syria and Turkey, is I met beautiful people. And that sounds strange, because I don't say that about England, that this person's beautiful.
Yeah.
Right? It's a bizarre statement to make. But I met beautiful people. People who gave you warm handshakes. Yeah. People who didn't have much to eat but said, please sit with me and eat this food.
Right.
You know, people who would give you a hug and you just felt warmth.
Right.
You don't get me wrong. It's a complex society. There are a lot of people that treated me in other ways as well. But that was something that I took away with myself.
You know, you this weekend you had mentioned in the intro that one of the things that you encourage people to do to connect with our legacy is traveling to Muslim lands.
That's right.
And it seems like when you're saying that, I think that's, and your earlier example too about your Saudi friends. Yeah. Because, you know, we'd have these, when I went to undergrad back in Ohio, we get some Saudi students. And when I'd meet them, I was like, oh, mashallah, you know about the Lajna Daima and Sheikh bin Baz. Yeah. They would know, like, Sheikh bin Baz, he was the Grand Mufti, right? Rahimahullah. But, like, they knew, but in general, they weren't like, I thought they'd be like quoting like the kibar, the scholars that, or the issues that I'd be talking about. And they'd be like, nah, man, we're just here to like, you know, eat, you know, not mansaf, but, what's the, kabsa.
Kabsa, yeah.
We're like, come over, we're about to have kabsa or something, you know?
And you know what? It's fascinating. We have, when you're at a particular distance, you create particular imaginations of people. Right. And then you assume that that's what the world is like. And both in terms of the positives and negatives, we have these perceptions. And even now, even though we have the internet and we seem to assume that we know what people are like in other parts of the world. Right. I mean, like I live in Turkey right now, and what we do on the internet, especially in the Anglosphere in particular, is we have constructed a particular perception of what we think those places are like. Right. Which is helped by certain information that we are able to attain, but it doesn't provide us the whole picture. And you do need to be on the ground to get that whole picture. You do need to invest on the ground to have that whole picture. It's like, you know, me going to work and people assuming they know what I'm like. Right. Well, you haven't stayed in my home. You haven't met my mother. You haven't met my sister, my father. You haven't spoken to my friends. So the only perception you have of me is a perception that you can see. It's a very narrow one. Now, it is a perception of me, but it's not a total.
It reminds me on that same note, in America, what happened is, so I'm a Maliki, I play Sadl. Yeah. And it's often, it doesn't happen a lot, but I heard one Maliki teacher say this, that it's, you know, from time to time it'll happen. It'll be like, you know, after the prayer, like, oh, brother, I noticed something about your prayer, etc., etc. And in your head, you're like, yo, dude, I don't even know you. Yeah. Right? Why are you like interrogating my prayer? Like there's no relationship there. Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Totally. Totally. And you can see like how we, like, I mean, I was joking with some guys here when I came here. I said, this country does feel like a bubble to me. And it does, because in terms of time zone, I'm disconnected from the Muslim world. Right. In terms of what's going on here, you know, it's just different. It hits different. It's true. But when I'm back in the Muslim world, you feel part of that collective. Now, this is going to sound really harsh in this sense, but when I was in Manhattan, it felt very dunyawi. Right. Now, you know, everything was geared towards just dunya. People in the bars, pubs, people wanted to have fun, people need entertainment, go shopping, you know. Everything I saw was that there was no outlet for me in that sense, unless if you're in particular communities. And yet in the Muslim world, for some of the challenges they do have, and they do have a lot of challenges, but that's one thing that I do appreciate in terms of the trade-off, that when you go out.
Yeah. I'm sure my listeners are tired of me here talking about Fez, because like, but I think that's what, like, that's when I went to Fez, I was like,
Mhm.
there's something in the air here.
So when I was in Malaysia, I had a conversation with a
Yeah.
Professor Wan, and he used the word osmosis, which
Mm.
I then internalized and started using as
Yeah.
well. And I totally understood what he was saying when he says, like, when you're in Muslim nations and so forth, it's osmosis. So you feel it in the air.
Right.
We know the issues on the ground,
Right.
but it's still there. There's history. It's so deeply rooted in the fabric of that culture and that society that sometimes you can only learn things from osmosis. So there are many things that I've now learned regarding Islam that I don't even appreciate. My friends highlight to me that there's been a change in you. I go, really?
Mm.
And I haven't realized that I've picked it up via behavior, by being in the Muslim world. And that's intriguing. And the opposite is also true, that when I was coming from the West, you behave, or one behaves in a particular way, where you come into Muslim countries, this particular perception and like disposition and judging people, not knowing that, the rest of the world doesn't think like you.
Well, I think that's the case for this, like people who are still talking about hijrah
Mhm.
is for like to be in an environment of tarbiyah.
Yeah. So today, as you know, when I was teaching, I was saying there's something invested in the languages and Islamic languages in
Right.
which tarbiyah is in it.
Yeah.
You use the third person and things like that, right?
Yeah.
But not only that, like even the hijrah question is fascinating for me because back to the point I talked to you about, and which I felt for a very long time, is a sense of dislocation, and it's the idea of like, how do I make sense of my being? Now, when you go to Muslim countries, you also feel a sense of dislocation, but on a different level, because people will joke all the time and say, you can be quite British in the way you behave sometimes. I go, what do you mean? You're very methodical in the way you think. You're very like surgical in the way that you do things.
Mm-hmm.
I say, oh yeah, of course you're right, and that happens. But I sort of said to myself that if my parents had the capacity to struggle it out and come to England for money and for economic reasons, then why can I not struggle it out in a Muslim country for deen?
Right.
So that was the trade-off I made, which sounded ridiculous for many people. When you say that actually to Muslims, it sounds, we know it, we hear it, but for someone to actually do it, you say you're crazy. So people will come to the West because they're economic migrants, political migrants, maybe education, marriage.
Right.
But when you say to someone, I moved back to the Muslim world for deen, why? Yeah.
Well, so and you're obviously making some living in Syria. You could live, right?
Yeah.
It's not like you're a single guy. You're not
Yeah.
like needing to. You don't have like luxurious taste,
That's
right? So you're able to get by. Your needs, your basic needs are met. So
Yeah.
you're like, oh, I'm getting
That's
my
right.
deen. So
the key is that everything's a trade-off.
right.
So the trade-off by living in the Muslim world was, I'm not going to have possibly some of those material sort of like commodities that I can enjoy.
What kind of things did you miss from England on your Syria trips?
So Syria is hard for people to understand this. Even getting Coca-Cola was tough in Syria.
No kidding.
So they had no McDonald's.
Mm.
I remember I used to tell my friends who used to go to Lebanon,
Okay.
like, can you go to Starbucks and get me a muffin?
From Lebanon and bring it back.
Yeah, or can you get me a, I don't know if it was Crispy Donuts in those days. I don't know. Krispy Kreme, I think so. I don't know if they existed, but one of these companies existed, and we used to tell them, when you go to Lebanon, to Beirut, can you bring me this donut? It was totally disconnected in that sense. I remember, this is true story, we used to go to a place called Pizza Hut.
Yeah,
there was no such thing as Pizza Hut. There was a place called Pizza Hut, and we used to go to that place, and we used to laugh. In that sense. So it was very different in terms of, my diet was literally Syrian food. It was, kibbeh Lebanese. It was, these type of foods. It was just different. And you thought to yourself, wow, there was no metro system in Damascus at that time.
Okay.
During those days, you took this bus or these little service cars, which are these little like vans that were like taxis, and you jumped in, and it was a different world. It was an absolute different world.
Did you get plugged into so I know with like the different Sufi turuk have like, hadras and things of that sort. Like I know it's in Amman when visitors go, they might go in some areas, but did Damascus have that kind of scene?
It did in certain mosques and places. I genuinely didn't subscribe to just joining that, but from time to time I would turn up as an observer for sure.
That's what I meant. Just to expose yourself to it.
Yeah, for sure. Because that is something I never saw in England.
Right.
That is something I never saw in England. And not only that, you would have these groups that recite nasheeds in a particular way that I'd never seen in England.
Sure.
But not only that, the ulama. I remember when I met Sheikh Bhuti for the first time, for example.
So when you're referencing Sheikh Bhuti, you actually met him?
Yeah,
okay.
in Masjid al-Umawi.
Okay.
And he was a few seconds, he was really polite, really kind. And I remember the office, he was sitting there and there's like seats covered with the ulama.
Right.
And one of my friends was just shoving me in.
Yeah.
And this is Sheikh Bhuti. And, people were doing this thing where they were shaking his hand and he was pulling it away.
Yeah.
And I was very English. I just shook his hand like an English way, Yeah, hey, how you doing? And he just smiled at me and he asked them, where's he from? And they said, Pakistan. He goes, MashaAllah, what are you doing? And he said, he's teaching English here. And he said, MashaAllah. And I said, thanks. Well, we're grateful to have you in the country. And I said, oh, thank you very much. And what I'm saying is that, put Sheikh Bhuti as a person to a side, but just looking at the ulama as a whole, in those days, as I told you before, when you wear a particular uniform, you carry yourself in a particular way. And to see people like that walking down the street,
right,
that was something I'd never seen before in England. You had your Maulvi or your Imam in the local masjid, but this was different. And you saw people, the way that people respected them, the way that when dars was given, everybody was just sitting on the floor, just eagerly listening.
Right.
And that was something that I was not accustomed to, and that was something that I took away.
There was I've told a story before, but when I was in Fez, the brother who was like my tour guide, we were leaving a parking lot. We were about to go to the outskirts of the city for the view.
Right.
And it was before Maghrib. We had to go pick up my wife. I was with my friend as well.
Yeah.
He happened to just be there.
Yeah.
And he stops the parking lot. He's like, "Oh, there's a wali here. We have to go. I have to go give salams to him and ask him for dua."
Right.
He just pops out of the car, drops it, and just and I go with him.
Yeah.
And then he's blind.
Yeah.
He's an old blind man. He's like, everyone knows him. Sheikh Idris, like the dean of the Qairaween, they know him and everything. And he was like, I didn't the translator. He's like, and he the same thing. He was like inviting us in for his house, like, "Oh, we come to my house for tea."
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And those sort of things are just amazing. They blow your They literally blow you away.
He's like, it's like seconds of interaction, right? Yeah. You mentioned beauty, and I said, I had a chance to meet Molay Hashim al-Bagiti, rahimahullah. He was about 85 years old when I met him.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not. Yeah. And my comment when I left him, I was like, it's the most handsome 85-year-old man I've ever met in my life.
Yeah, and this is what I mean. Like, so when some people may have difference of opinion about the certain names that we're mentioning and so forth, but what you realize though is there is a particular disposition that exists in those nations that we are not accustomed to seeing in this part of the world.
Right.
They're in the fabric of that society. They're there. It's a form of, I can't think of a type of soft power.
Yeah.
It's walking around and you can see Islam moving around,
Exactly.
And you sort of adjust yourself in terms of even behavior in that sense. And, just listening to Quran, like, I pray to Allah Ta'ala that I get the opportunity to go to Masjid al-Umawi again. Because I took it for granted. I was always going in that masjid for the Jumu'ah, praying and so forth. Never crossed my mind that there will come a time where I'll never be able to go back. And just the different types of qira'at that I heard in Syria was just mind-blowing. Right now in Turkey, it's just mind-blowing. The Quran I listen to, it's just,
a friend of mine, I'd mentioned him while we were driving here. He has a home in Turkey, but he's based out of in the U.S., right? But we were talking about, I think when he came to town a few weeks ago, we were chatting and he was talking about like, the thing of it is that like, we are here actually on this earth. He's a physician. We are here on this earth to worship Allah, right? If that's the ultimate goal, right?
That's right.
So in America, it is quite challenging sometimes to meet the basic. Like you're running late for prayer.
That's right.
Our facilities aren't equipped for basic, for like wudu and stuff. So he's like, when he's in Istanbul, it's just like the adhan's going off. Yeah. He's like, when he's there for a few months every year, he's like, he's going in 5 prayers in a masjid and it's packed.
Yeah.
Right? And he's like, if this is life, if this was supposed to be life, right?
Yeah.
And everything, the paradigm is centered around the salah.
Yeah, that's right. Look, there are challenges, as you know, and we
Yeah.
both know, in Muslim
Right.
worlds, and I'm not going to pretend, but the trade-off for me was worth the trade-off. And I remember my father coming to Istanbul. I was living in Üsküdar, and my father's never traveled out to see me anyway, but he came to Istanbul, and I remember it was Salat al-Fajr in the morning, and he's just standing at the window. I kind of wake up and blurry-eyed look at him and go, "What are you doing?" He goes, "Yakoob, it's the muezzin. It's the azan." I said, yeah, he does that. And he goes, "I haven't heard this in 30 years. And I was like, oh, wow, of course.
Right.
And even I forgot, and I remember when I go back to England and I can't hear the call to prayer, that something as basic as that, it's really coercive. I say this about England, that it feels like there's no spirit in the city.
Right.
The soul is missing. Whereas the hustle and bustle in many Muslim societies.
I mean, the spirit will show up during the World Cup in the Euros.
Yeah, of course, that's right. That's right. But exactly, you see that type of spirit in those moments when, sort of like sporting events takes place, because that's a religion for them.
Right.
In that sense. But, it's that which I find disconnecting. Like when I come back to England, I forget. There are times, I'm not going to lie, when I'm in the Muslim world, I get frustrated. I'm just exhausted. I'm like, what's going on here, And then I say, I just want to go back to England. I'm done. And the minute I go home to visit my folks, after a week, I said, no, this was a mistake.
When's the last time you went to Pakistan?
20 years ago.
20 years. Okay, so because I'm trying to internalize your comment about visiting the Muslim world.
Yeah.
I'm from Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And I was mentioning, I told you we were just there a few months ago, right?
Yeah.
You hear the adhan.
That's right.
Right? I don't know if this is me being judgmental. But it's the same way. It's easy. There's musalla, masajid everywhere, right? But you don't see the same, like, I feel like I'm almost programmed to not be scammed by somebody.
Right. I get what
or get hustled. Where like in Fez, because Fez was very unique. So we went to Tangier. Tangier was not like Fez. Chef Shaoun was nice in Morocco, but it wasn't like Fez.
Right.
Fez was like almost like Medina.
Right. So for me, when I encourage people to come to Muslim countries, is actually I don't even have an issue of just trying to pretend that it's going to be great and perfect.
Yeah.
They just need to understand the mechanizations of where they're going.
Right.
In order to understand what it means to belong to, what it means to belong to Muslim societies.
Right.
And so, like when you're talking about Bangladesh, and I could talk about Pakistan and so on, there is something that one could say in the sense of saying, you know what, I don't know, it doesn't feel like the way I expected. And I think that's the key for me, which is one, have zero expectations.
Right.
Because you could just end up disappointed. But two, like when I look at the Islam of my parents, they took it from that part of the world. And it's infused in them. Whereas the Islam that I was carrying, I was searching for it. So I joke with people all the time that when I'm asleep at night, my mum is still praying and blowing on my face.
Right.
That was something she took from her culture. Nasheeds that my mum recites when I was a young kid, she took from her culture. So for her, and my father, for example, I remember my father, I used to tell people this, which might sound bizarre, which is he used to write Quran on pieces of paper, put it in water, and have to drink the water and then swallow the paper, which was quite unique in that sense.
Before the bid'ah police come up, just keep it in context.
Yeah. So, it was an old methodology of him learning something in regards to Quran in Uganda at the time. Right? And he would do that, and I would think to myself, what's going on here? And what I realized is the way that they had learned Islam was just everyday practice, whether you agree or disagree.
Right.
It was everyday practice. Whereas in England, I had to study it to understand it. It wasn't a lived experience.
Right.
Now, we do have institutions and we teach Islam in the schools and so forth, but by and large, the environment is non-Islam.
Right. So now walk me through the next steps. You finish your 3.5 years at Damascus. You get your master's at SOAS?
That's right.
Okay.
So I had a friend in Syria. His name was Abdurrahman Steve Ide. Shout out to Steve Ide. I haven't heard from him in ages. And
maybe these podcasts he'll get a hold of you.
Inshallah. And he used to study Ottoman history in Istanbul.
Right.
So he was at a university in Istanbul, coming back and forth.
Sure.
His wife was Syrian. and he would bring me books, and on Ottoman history, and I would read them, and I said, "Oh, this is interesting," because when you would walk out into Damascus, like Damascus was a minefield of Islamic history.
Mm-hmm.
I'd go to the tomb of Salahuddin all the time, and people don't know this. Salahuddin has two tombs. One is his real tomb, and another one given by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Right, which was given to the Ottomans as a gift to sort of like commemorate Salahuddin.
Right.
And you would walk around, and the market was called Suq al-Hamidiyya, named after Abdul Hamid II.
Right.
They had a dish called Midhat Pasha, who was the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, and things like that. So these things were intriguing for me, where in Syria they were hiding the Ottoman past. And they were very anti-Ottoman, in the establishment at least. And Abdul Rahman would just keep bringing me these books, and I'd say, "Hey man, what's going on here?" And then I got really interested. My mum got sick. So I said, "You know what, why don't I come to London and be with my family?" And I signed up to a master's where Ottoman history was one of the modules I took with Professor Ben Fortner, who was very influential in me doing Ottoman studies.
How hard was it, by the way? Because you mentioned you weren't the best student in undergrad.
It was tough.
To get into the program?
To get into the program, I got into the program because I lived in Syria. So when I did the proposal, and I remember answering the question, and I remember the person who had examined me said, "You haven't used any of the books we asked you to use." And I said, "Yeah, but I live in Syria. You know, I'm a British Muslim who's gone to Syria. I'm doing blah blah blah."
Right.
And they took a punt with me, and they took a chance with me. I went to SOAS. First essay, failed it. So there we go. I still remember there was a colleague of mine. I asked her, I said, she got a first. I said, "Can I have a look at your essay, please?"
Yeah.
She goes, "Yeah, sure." So I look at hers, I look at mine, and just by comparison, I start to figure out how to write. I say, okay, so she's doing, is that what footnotes look like that? And I started to formulate.
Because you're not even reading many English books at the volume yet, right?
No. And I still remember Ben Fortner when I spoke to him. I said, "Man, this is tough. Like, I can't formulate that type of language that they speak." And he said to me at the time, he goes, "Listen, I don't mind if you write in hip-hop, so long as I understand." And he was great in that sense. He really encouraged me.
Right.
Because in the class, I was very vocal. I really had internalized it. I loved what he was teaching. I was into it.
Right.
I'd read these books before, but I just didn't know how to translate my thoughts onto paper because I wasn't trained to do that.
Specifically, what was his area of expertise?
Late Ottoman history, but in particular, the educational system during the time of Abdul Hamid II.
Okay, I got you. And that, is it safe to say that influenced your interest in 19th century Ottoman history as well?
Two things one was the question of how did it collapse.
Okay.
Like, I was like interested in that all of a sudden.
Sure.
Like, what happened here, right? Especially when I was living in Syria. But he actually, when he was doing his course, in his book itself, his book was on the ulama being teachers in the late Ottoman Empire, and it wasn't a decline of the ulama, but the ulama was still relevant and important.
Right.
And how they were using morality as a way of maintaining a particular mannerism. And I just thought, wow, I started to look and try to understand more about the ulama and couldn't find works on Ottoman studies of that standard. So he got my interest in that. Mm-hmm. I don't think he knew he was doing that, but that was my interest. Now, what was interesting at the time is in that class, I was the only non-Turkish Muslim in that class.
Okay.
And that was interesting for me. And I remember when I used to talk to other Muslims about Ottoman history, they were not interested.
So non-Turks. So you're the only Muslim in the class.
So there was one Turkish sister who was in the class.
Okay.
And for Turks, it's a staple.
Okay.
But then everybody else was non-Muslim, and then there was me. And for me, I was really looking at his Islamic history, and I was like debating with my professor all the time that Muslims don't do this. That doesn't make sense. When he would give us texts, I'd read the text and go, "Wait, hang on a minute, that doesn't make sense."
Right.
And so it wasn't him because he was great, but the corpus of the work was somehow conflicting with my own lived experience. So I'm not just talking about my lived experience growing up, my lived experience of going to Turkey, going to Syria, going to Muslim countries, and then saying, we're not like that. So wait, hang on a minute. Were we like that?
Yeah.
And I remember then going to a couple of conferences and meeting like other academics who were so for example, Rifat Abu al-Hajj, he was considered as being a more liberal academic from Palestinian background.
Okay.
And he said something interesting in his talk, and he was old. He said, when I started writing Ottoman history, my professor was Bernard Lewis, the famous Orientalist.
Right.
But I took my understanding of Ottoman history from my mother, who was Palestinian. Because when I was learning, he said, she understood the nature of us as Palestinians better than the way it was being explained to us. So he said, I had a bit of conflict here.
Right.
So just hearing him say that made me realize that, okay, my instinct's not that wrong here.
Sure.
We don't need to read Edward Said to know that something bogus is going on. You just know that actually I'm part of a chain of peoples. And we're not that different from most people in the past. So when I'm scrutinizing the past, I'm saying, could they have done that? And they're saying, well, yeah, they could have, but we don't have evidence for that. And I was saying, but is this a valid question? Yeah, but And so when I start asking those questions, sooner or later you find the evidence for it. And you say, okay, hang on a minute. So there is a blind spot because of the way it views Islam.
Yeah.
It judges Islam like it's an object that can be judged.
Yeah.
And there are inbuilt assumptions that are already ingrained in the way they speak of it.
In engineering, we have this thing when we're doing like a root cause analysis of a failure. Let's say like we have a plant shut down.
Right.
So you don't know what happened.
Right.
You have these like called probable causes.
Right.
You have root cause.
Right.
But then you have a lot of times you just don't know because you don't have camera. You don't know. It's like probable cause. Right. And then you start examining. But people, if they already have something in their head,
right,
they will like try to eliminate the probable cause. And when you're looking at the verbiage, you're like, you don't have a sufficient evidence to eliminate this probable cause.
That's right.
This you're making a jump here.
Yeah. And what's even more interesting is, as a Muslim, actually my interests and my questions were different.
Right.
I wasn't intrigued in the type of things that most people in the field of Ottoman studies were interested in.
What is like harems and like stuff like that?
Basically, exactly. Right? That was not an interest of mine. For me, the interest was, where's the Islam?
Right.
Is there Islam in this Ottoman Empire? Because at the moment, it feels like there's nothing there.
Is that the... I have a theory after like studying, learning from the last couple of days. What this is probably 2008 by now, 2009?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So, it's funny. That's your move to Chicago.
Yeah.
Why do you think there weren't a lot of Muslims interested in Ottoman history at the time?
That's a good question. You might have a better thought process than me. I mean, at the time, I just didn't have a clue. We didn't have Otto-Delilish. The Ottomans were presented in a way that were like they weren't very Islamic and Muslim. So most people then just dismissed them outright. The nation states had presented the Ottomans in a particular way, so they were dismissed from that context. And as I said to you before, like growing up in Britain, we had an issue, which was in Britain, you have the history of Britain, Queen and Country, or keep saying Queen Country. She's dead now, but but that was a narrative. Queen and Country.
She was alive so long, she has a residual effect.
That's right. So you had this idea of Queen and Country. You had the idea of the two great wars.
Right.
You learned about the Tudors. You learned about the Windsors. You learned about the Vikings, the Romans. You didn't learn about Islamic history. So there's a disconnect there, right?
Right.
Whereas mainstream society, as I said, from Osmosis, understood what it meant to be British.
Right.
But then you didn't have an understanding of your homeland, whatever that may be.
Right.
So you didn't have a historical understanding of that part. So that dislocation was huge. So we just never learned history. We just didn't. I remember when we did World War I, the Ottomans were not even there. They just mentioned the Turks in a sentence and we kept moving. So we're not taught in the West. So there was no need for Muslims to study Ottoman history. And then families, like I said before, my mother and father were the same. Study the STEM. That's where the money is.
So I'll tell you my theory.
Go for it.
All right. So let's talk about from how I understand American Muslims and why we ignored it. Right.
Right.
The Salafis, first of all, that's right. That's where I came through. Number one, we were all about the House of Saud. Just keep it straight up. That's self-explanatory.
Right.
The Ottomans were heretics.
Right.
you know.
Right.
And Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab came and saved the day with Al Saud, and that's it. So they're a bunch of deviants.
Right.
We don't need to. We ignore them.
See, we didn't have that strong narrative in England in that sense. I think.
I'm not saying they said that out loud, but I'm pretty sure that's one of the underlying reasons behind it. If I'm thinking, that's my analysis.
So, like I told you, like a lot of like my local imam was reciting a khutbah with the name of Abdul Hamid II in it.
Yeah.
Not even knowing it was that the name of Abdul
And he was
Hamid
South Asian?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was something there in the historical past. There's just no
right.
no memory of it. We didn't have that antagonism. It was just not there.
Right. Well, I'm not saying there was antagonistic because, like, I didn't hear negative Ottoman stuff.
Right.
I'm just saying that's probably why it wasn't presented.
That's interesting.
And I mentioned it earlier today that, like, for example, Sheikh Zahid al-Kawthari is hated by Salafis.
Right. That's interesting.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is all coming to me now as I'm hearing you talk about it, and I'm like, wait a second. Yeah. Maybe this is why. Maybe this is why.
Yeah.
You think about maybe the more traditional Sufi type individuals.
Right.
The Deobandis, they had the Mughals.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe within their circles, they're teaching about Mughals.
Yeah.
But you're talking about like the Hamza Yusufs, the Zaytuna Institutes.
Right.
A lot of that is like about forging an American Muslim identity.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so I think that's where it's there. It's more like looking forward rather than looking at history. So I think there's that element too within the practicing. I'm just trying to assess it from all the practicing Muslims.
Right.
And that's funny now because you have Salafis who are about Durs Ertugrul.
Yep.
And I find it hilarious how they now have a favorable opinion of Ibn Arabi.
Okay. Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Because Ibn Arabi, because some of them will, kind of all of a sudden Ibn Arabi is a popular person.
Right.
And I think the reason is that we are, because I think it comes down to substance, right? I think you mentioned something like this earlier in the class, that we sometimes are fed narratives about people without knowing anything about them.
That's right.
Right? So, for example, like when you're a Salafi, you know, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Arabi, they're kuffar.
Right.
Or guilty of kufr. Right? Etc.
Totally.
Right? You hear it, but it's never like you move on.
Right.
It's in the back of your head.
Right.
Now, when you watch a show like Ertugrul, it's not like Ibn Arabi shows up in like the first episode.
Yeah.
That show, by the time you're into the show, you're worked up. You're like into it. You're into it.
You're invested.
And Ibn Arabi shows up as this like guide murabbi figure for Ertugrul. Yeah. And now you're watching something. You're consuming content through your eyes, and that's why the impact of television.
Right.
And now it's bypassing some side note because Ibn Arabi isn't someone that's like within like the modern Salafi dawah. It's not like they talk about him a lot.
Right.
If it comes up, they just say shaitan or something, right? And passing, and you move on.
Right.
You know, there's more focused hatred towards like people like Sayyid Qutb. To be honest.
Okay.
So I think that's where a lot of it comes from, and that's in my assessment. The other groups, like a lot of the American Muslims, are more like, "Hey, we're here in America. What are we gonna do going forward?"
Yeah.
So I think that's why there is this lack of history, and that's just my assessment, and that's probably back in 2008. Think about it. It's circumstantial.
Right.
You're in Damascus, and your friend.
Yeah.
It's a very personal.
Yeah, that's right.
Connection.
That's right.
That drives it.
That's right. Yeah, totally.
Know?
And it's fascinating listening to what you're saying. I mean, for me, like one of the arguments I've continuously made since I've been teaching here is that in Islam, your tradition and the past is a repository.
Right.
I mean, the idea of modernity is that it's progress, you keep moving forward, right? So when you're talking about forward, so the idea of even trying to forge an identity, being American, moving forward, is actually within the framework of modernity, which is to keep looking forward. Because to draw from a repository of the past regarding Islam's presence in the US could be quite limited,
right,
in comparison to. But that's why I say the Islamic past is large and vast. And when I'm learning Khulafa Rashidun, Umayyah, and Abbasids and so forth, like, just learn all of it.
Right.
That's your repository. That's your treasure chest. That's what you can draw from. And when we're saying Ummah today and the Ummatic paradigm, if we're going to use that term that's been popularized, it's not just now. It's that past, all of it.
Right.
And once you start to read about various things that Muslims have done, you sort of then understand, why you're here.
Yeah.
And, what Islam is and how Islam is still here, irrespective of all those challenges that we've went through.
Yeah.
And I said this today in the course, which was that we have a skewed imagination of the future.
Right.
Because the past is absent in the mind.
Right.
So it doesn't allow one to imagine a different type of future where we can be the center of it, which I make no apologies for, by the way. So it requires one to go into the past to make sense of these sort of things. So that's what movies do. Movies, they draw from a repository of the past. You look at Lord of the Rings, you look at, Game of Thrones, you look at all of these TV, One Piece in Japan, and, they're going through a repository of the past, rehashing it, talking in metaphors, visual metaphors to some degree, and bringing that back onto the table, right?
Sure. And I think I think people in general are attracted to history in different angles, right? In America, I have a friend named Dr. Will Caldwell. Maybe next, who knows when he comes to Chicago next time, but he wrote his Ph.D. thesis on the history of Islam in America, specifically on what originated in the southern United States, right? And so there's a lot of that with Malcolm X and like the transatlantic slave trade and all the Muslims that came from there. So there's a lot of interest there in America. For example, we have a town in Iowa called Al Qaeda, Iowa, named after Emir Abdul Qadir of Algeria.
Right. So what's interesting here as well, which is one, I think that history is fascinating, and that is something I would like to know about.
Right.
And when I was teaching in one of the classes, I put up a flag of the Young Turk Revolution, which said freedom, equality, liberty, and justice.
Right.
And we had a black brother, an elderly brother, wonderful, mashallah, sitting in the corner. He just looked at me.
Right.
And I started smiling because he and I understood. And I said, what does it remind you of? And he said, it reminds me of the flag of the Nation of Islam. So of course it does.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
Right.
The crescent moon, red with freedom.
And it's kind of like inverse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he just looked at it and I looked at it. Nobody else in the room got it.
Right.
And then we showed it.
Yeah.
And so even in that moment, there is still, like, if you look at the repository, it's still pulling from this past. So when we talk about Jefferson's Quran, the Turk is who?
Yeah.
It's the Ottoman, Muslim. When Arabs who migrated from the Arab provinces of South America, they're called Al-Turko. It means the Ottoman.
Sure.
So it's not, I'm not just saying it. I mean, you and I mentioned this before, that I don't have any hesitation saying this, that Africa is a Muslim continent for me. Right? The history of Islam in Africa is better study. And one of the ways when Allah Ta'ala talks in the Quran that He has made you different peoples and cultures and nations so that you may know one another, it's not just physically, it's the historical past too.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So that's important for me.
You had mentioned something on a previous podcast with Ahmed Khan. Shout out to Ahmed from Creative Minority. You guys kind of glossed over it, but so you actually so you get your master's, you end up finishing your PhD, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we're at today, right? I think it's important. I wanted people to understand, first of all, to tie that part up, like where you go from like flunking school, playing football, working in retail, to
getting serious.
Yeah, getting serious, right? Because I think once you're in your master's program, the moment you pretty much you write it, you can write it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because then I really sat there and believed.
Right.
And there was long moments where I was suffering from imposter syndrome because it's not just what I was reading felt strange to me in terms of Orientalism.
Right.
It's not just that, okay, I have to write essays and so forth, but academics can be quite savage. And the thing about academics is there are gatekeepers in academics and they want to put you in your place and remind you of that. And it sort of heightens your feeling of imposter syndrome where you think to yourself, am I wrong about this? When actually your instinct is right.
Right.
But you're being smashed by a group of people who actually don't understand your tradition better than you.
Right.
But I came through that.
Yep.
I then did the PhD.
Yep.
And I find it strange sometimes when I'm speaking and people are writing notes.
Right.
And I remember there's an academic by the name of Engin Akarlı. He was at Brown University, the head of the history department. He now lives in Turkey.
Right.
And I went to see him once, and I said, Engin Hoca, I'm done with academia. I'm going to go back to my day job and maybe teach English or something. And he goes, no, you deserve to be here. And I said, but I'm not publishing. I don't have time to publish and so forth. He goes, it doesn't take away from your intelligence. It doesn't take away from the fact that, you're speaking to people all the time and you're making a difference.
Right.
So you're not going to be judged by that. And that I think was important.
Yeah. So, so now moving on to like what you mentioned on Ahmed's, podcast was that like, sometimes there's an either or dichotomy.
Right.
We're in STEM. I'm a mechanical engineer by degree, right?
Right.
I'm not going back to formal education at this point in time. But like, what thought it seems like you've thought a little bit about like, you've got a 34-year-old, like, we know in Islamic sciences, I've met people from interviewing people on podcasts, like that they'll be in their mid-30s, they're doing well, they have a corporate career.
Yeah.
But then they have like, I have some bandwidth, I have some time.
Right.
I need to pursue a passion.
Right.
Of like, there's some question, some burning thing that I need to learn about.
Yeah.
Right. Like how, like, have you thought about a process for people to become an expert in a certain field? And, I guess, how does that look like?
At the moment, I'm saying we're at a formative period where we need to create thinkers and historians, and we need to create curricular and syllabus.
Sure.
So we need to, I said this so many times, I'll say it again.
Yeah.
We are expert consumers of knowledge. We are lagging behind on equal weight of being producers of knowledge.
Right.
So now we need to find a way of producing knowledge at the same level that is not only helpful for people in the communities. The number of sisters, and I say sisters because recently a brother asked me, but then he told me, my wife told me to ask you, which is, what can I teach my kids for them to read? And so there are a lot of sisters educating their kids at home, homeschooling, maybe just wanting to read books to them at night, talk to them about Islamic history. And you realize then that there is a dearth of literature on a basic level for children, let alone adults, in which Islamic history is something that they can engage with. Like everyone knows Firas al-Khatib's book.
Yep.
Right? Everyone knows that book, including Imran Khan. Where's
the Prime Minister of Pakistan?
Yeah, that's right.
No kidding.
Yeah, he mentioned it. Yeah. And then you say to yourself,
I invited him tonight, by the way, but he's in Texas.
Okay. and then you say, like, okay, where are the other books?
Yeah.
And Firas, I don't know him personally, but I'm assuming when he goes back and looks at that book, he'll probably have a host of criticisms towards that book.
Sure.
Now that he's doing a PhD program and whatnot, right?
Right.
But we don't have anything of that equivalent. We want people to some people dibble dabble on YouTube, write a couple of articles for various Muslim websites and so on. But actually producing something comprehensively, one, is missing. Two, I think academics like myself, and I hold myself accountable here, those of us who are doing Islamic history, and there are a lot of Muslims doing they're doing history, they need to come down to the community and find a way of educating them. I think that's a responsibility they need to take on their shoulders. Don't get me wrong, it's nice publishing and getting careers and tenure and so forth, and that's important. I get it. But at the same token, who are you publishing for?
Right.
If the publications are for an elite group of thinkers, or predominantly they're not Muslim, then we have a situation. So there has to be a way where some sort of engagement takes place where academics come down and help. And the other thing is the seminaries. I think the seminaries need to include Islamic history in the curricula. Like you came today. There's so many, the talks that I give, and especially in the US, were kids from the seminaries. They want to know. They're thirsty for this stuff.
Right.
And we are at a wonderful moment right now, and I didn't realize this, and I should have caught on to this. There's a moment where people want to know about Islamic history. And also could have been a trigger regarding that.
Right.
When I was a kid, we used to watch a show called The Sword of Tipu Sultan. Have you ever seen it?
No.
It was from India. It was the first time an Indian production was like Tipu, a Muslim, like fighting the British and so on. It was huge when we were kids. But that evaded people's memories. But Ertugrul has left a little imprint. Hopefully, we can kick on from that and do various things about Islamic history and teach it. So this is, for me, the next stage that regarding the learning of history that needs to take place. And that means that invest in people who are doing these works. Because, I can tell you this now, history was perceived as a privilege. People day-to-day STEM need to get married, need to earn money, need to take care of the family.
Right.
You're a historian, you must have money. No, I came from a broke family.
Yeah.
And, I had family members who were telling me, for example, what are you doing? Who's going to pay you to think?
Right.
Get a proper job.
Yeah.
And I remember when I got my job, I said, I'm getting paid to think.
Yeah.
But actually, alhamdulillah, like I'm getting paid to give da'wah.
Right.
That's my job, which is amazing. Alhamdulillah ta'ala. Now, I'm not making much money. That's fine. But alhamdulillah, Allah ta'ala still continuously facilitates a way where I have the opportunity to teach people Islam.
Right.
And there is something important in that. And there is a value in that. And I think our communities need to invest in that equally, because you're going to lose your kids. They not just history, but just generally, because the only Islam they get are in snippets.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the Islam they live in terms of live experience, and this is the non-Islam,
Right.
including their phones,
Right.
which they're engaging with.
Yeah.
And it requires an active engagement and interaction in regards to making that change. And right now, I'll stress on this, that it's about time that we said, let's make that change and let's invest money into these fields. And let's for now, let's have a plaster
Yeah.
and get some of these academics down to produce. But in the long term,
Right.
we have to write our own history.
I guess what I was like trying to frame this more like,
Yeah.
I'll give you, I like using avatars.
Okay.
35-year-old dude, let's say he's an engineer.
Right.
Not me, but let's
Right.
say, and so the purpose of this podcast,
Mm.
of this channel,
Mhm.
again, the theme is helping American Muslim men
Right.
live the deep life, right?
Right.
So there's an element of spirituality,
Right.
career finance, fitness, all that
Okay.
stuff, right? An intellectual pursuit is part of it.
Yeah, that's
I think is part of having a well-lived deep
Yeah.
life, right? And I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm 30. Let's take me for example.
Mhm.
Let's say I don't have an Islamic topic off the top of my head,
Mhm.
but in America, this is the way we sometimes we think about things. The thing that's always been interesting to me,
Mhm.
and you might laugh, the one topic that like always resonates with me is the assassination of John F. Kennedy,
Okay, well,
right?
yeah.
Because when I was a kid, when I was a 7-year-old, I memerized all the presidents.
Yeah.
At the time, Reagan was president. You guys had Thatcher, we had Reagan,
Yeah.
right? Now granted, is there dawah involved there? I don't know, but then we don't find like practicing. So Dr. Jonathan Brown actually mentioned this one time, that we don't find like you have practicing Muslims want to do Islamic studies, and he's like, no, like why don't you practicing Muslims go study political science or Western civilization?
Yeah.
And then, but you're practicing, so now you know how to deconstruct that,
Yeah, that's right.
or you become an SME in that, and then just know you're, you know what I'm saying? That's a kind of like like it's a different angle, right? But let's say, for example, I'll give maybe an example that make more sense for you. I'm Bangladeshi, and I'm interested in the last 100 years of Mughal rule in Dhaka.
Right.
All right, that's what I want to focus on, because I think what I'm hearing from you and from other PhDs, even that like. It's almost like you have a burning question that you cannot sleep without, and I think that's what's kind of like people, this whole, and I think one of the issues with the Ertugrul phenomenon is that it's not like Ertugrul and it's over.
Yeah.
Now you're hooked on every Turkish drama.
Yeah,
so you're
right.
spending all your time watching like Alparslan, Kurulus Osman.
Right.
There's other stuff like
right.
Abdul Hamid.
That's
you
right.
know?
That's right.
So now you're watching TV the whole time. So you're not really reading anything or researching.
Yeah.
So that's the problem that's kind of the trap.
Yeah.
But like, let's say I want to study, I want to become like, I got my job, I have my fitness, and I have some time. I want to now delve into this specific topic, and I want to really learn it deep. I'm not going to get a PhD because I'm not going back to formal school, but I do want to become a subject matter expert in this and achieve depth, and maybe write about it later and contribute.
Right.
How does that look like? That's what I was kind of getting at. Like, where do you start? Do you have to start with the root languages? Like, if you're going to study about the Mughals, right? Well, I speak Bengali. Right. I might have to learn to read and write it too, right?
Right.
Is that where you start first, the primary languages?
So I think language is important.
Okay.
I think we need to learn languages.
Okay.
Irrespective of whether we're going to do something like that or not.
Sure.
Just because I made the argument that there's a lot more Islam in Islamicate languages than the non-Islamicate languages.
Right.
But in regards to Islamic studies and history, that mainly is the field of academia. What we need to do is now try to create alternative spaces. And I believe this. I think the university system is a struggling institution in the 21st century.
Right.
The internet has done something interesting in that sense. And so there are possibilities of collaboration between different peoples of different backgrounds to try to come up with ways of teaching Islamic history in which you can pass off a particular mode of thinking in which people can start producing expert literature.
Okay.
That's very possible. So, for example, I teach in a university.
Yeah.
Whatever I teach in a university, I do the exact same thing on Zoom. Right? To students around the world.
Right.
And this is intriguing because these kids could not get access to me. Now they can.
Okay.
The same, apart from being in front of a screen, the same methodology I'm using.
Yeah.
So I'm educating my kids in the classroom. I'm educating these kids at home in the same way. They get all the skills that are required in terms of how to be a good historian.
Right.
They learn the methodology in terms of how to write. They may not have a certificate,
right,
but they know how to produce that literature in the way that we see fit. And that creates a robust environment of the production of knowledge. Do you know what I mean?
And I think that we have to overcome our bias about not having a certificate, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You gotta stop caring about it because you're not gonna go back and get it, and then you won't learn anything.
Look, I'll be frank with you.
Yeah.
Like, I don't. In my workplace, we used to have a joke, which is I never put doctor next to my name.
Right.
So when you came to my door, they forgot to put the doctor there.
Yeah.
So people didn't know.
Yeah.
But it didn't change the fact that I was knowledgeable.
Right.
And generally, it's really interesting. Once you get your certificates, the world really doesn't care about your certificates. They care about what you're saying. They care about what you write. They care about how you think. And intelligent people will pick up on the mistakes of other people. You just have a disposition of doing that. So it's about good production, good knowledge, producing it well, and instilling that in people, teaching that to them. That does not need to be done. Not everybody can go to university, and that's okay. But the knowledge can be transferred outside of the university circuit. For sure it can.
So they're almost like, it seems like the model almost seems to be like find people like there's already an expert, who's done some kind of work.
That's right.
Get the background. There's a foundation has to be built first.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Go find those people out, seek them out, learn from them. Like you said, history is taught. It's not read from books.
That's right. So it's interesting because you and I had this conversation, or you were there when I had the conversation, which was that people always ask me this question: what books can I read? And I always feel reluctant.
I hate that question. You know why?
Yeah.
I ask the same question. And we're all hypocrites because we ask for the list and we don't read the books.
I don't know, but people ask me that question all the time.
Yeah.
I hesitantly make lists for them.
Yeah.
But with the disclaimer that, look, so one of the things that we've become accustomed to in the West in particular, and print capitalism in Western societies has done this, which is we write books for them to be read.
Right.
Whereas in Islam and Islamic tradition, books were written to be taught. Right? It's a different methodology.
Yeah.
Now, when I'm doing history, the reason why this question is frustrating to me at times is because people just think if I read a book, I can do history, or I know history, or I listened to a podcast and this is what happened in history. And I'm saying, no, actually, this is a vocation in which we need to teach you in a particular way that you think, so that you know how to be critical when you're looking at sources, and you know how to understand how these sources are talking about you, because actually history is ideological.
Right.
It's an ideological vocation, and it operates as a machinery in a particular way, in the way it speaks about peoples and traditions and cultures and so on. So what you want to do is this is why when I was in the class, I started off with that first disclaimer, right? Which always catches people off guard.
Yeah.
And what's this got to do with history? Like, why is he doing this stuff? The reason being is because I'm highlighting to them already.
Right.
And I'm trying to set up your mind in understanding that my vocation that I belong to, it is it's predicated on a particular set of assumptions, which is secularism. And it has a particular ingrained opinion about religion generally, but Islam more specifically. And it speaks about Islam as an authority that it doesn't have the right to do. And we need to be writing from the inside the tradition. So you can still train people up to understand that. And then they can start publishing. And then you can have people they can go to backwards, forwards.
You talked about, since it's a good segue, the idea of motivation of historians, right? I think you mentioned this when you were Dr. Shadi last week. And he was kind of saying, like, okay, you're not Muslim, therefore we're not just going to take from you. Like, what's your motivation? You're not going to get highly paid. Like, an Ottoman historian isn't going to get paid well. I don't know. I find that hard to. I think that's a jump to say that they have no motivation. There's no financial motivation, right? But to say that there's no. So let's say, for example, for Ottoman history, Osman's Dream by Caroline Finkel gets mentioned a lot, right?
Yeah.
She's British. She lives in Istanbul still, or
no? I think she
moved back.
She might be in the US actually.
Really? Okay. Yeah. I remember she was in Istanbul for some time.
Yeah.
But like someone like her, I don't know if you know her, but like, what's the someone like what would you assume motivates someone like her?
It's the quest for knowledge. They have you study a particular field. You're intrigued about a particular group of people.
Right.
You invest your life in it, and when you invest your life to a particular form of learning, no matter what it is, you become at one with that form of learning.
Right.
You internalize it, and it becomes your lifelong work.
Right.
And for someone like her, it may not necessarily be about the money.
Right.
The money's irrelevant to her.
Right.
What she wants to do is she wants to be part of a corpus,
Right.
which is producing knowledge of a particular subject which she found interest in that particular given moment.
Right.
Just like when you spoke about JFK.
Yeah.
Right. That can happen.
Right.
And I think that is a fair way of being fair to certain academics who do
Right.
that. My issue is not with the individuals.
Okay.
My issue is with the machinery itself.
Okay.
The machinery of history is designed from a particular perspective that it doesn't allow a Muslim to think from an Islamic perspective to some degree when they're trying to write from a Muslim perspective. The rules of the game are already constructed, and then you have to go along with that. You can input certain things here and there and be clever in the way, but it's still a challenge and still a struggle.
Have you found let's say for example, like Islamic studies academics love talking about Sufism.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In Ibn Arabi. How do you wrap your head around this idea that these materialist academics want to talk about something so esoteric?
Yeah, it's intriguing for me as well. It's fascinating how there's a particular arrogance regarding power.
Okay.
In the way that it feels like it has the right to be able to talk about everything and anything.
Right.
That's even not part of its tradition.
Right.
Right? Which we don't do.
Yep.
So it's an intriguing thing. Like, when I'm in England, there's a show called Question Time.
Okay.
Where panelists sit around a table and they talk about what Britain should do in the rest of the world.
Really?
Yeah. So they'll say, they'll have conversations, say, oh, we shouldn't be sending troops to Iraq anymore. We should pull them back. And someone else said, no, actually, we should keep the troops there. Or, how comes the Taliban are not letting women go to school? We should do this, this, this. It's intriguing that they have this mindset where they have a belief that they're entitled to talk about other people in this way.
Okay.
Now, if you went to Turkey, there is no TV show that talks about Britain or America in that way.
Right.
So it's intriguing how, what I'm saying is this particular form of power formulation, which is the Western University, has created a particular mindset in which those who go into it have internalized the idea that they have the right to speak about all these subjects that have nothing to do with them just because they can.
Right.
Because we have institutions that support that.
Right.
Funding and whatnot.
Sure.
Right.
And the final topic I want to cover with you, because I'm sure there's people waiting for you.
That's all good, bro.
So last week with Dr. Shadi, you guys briefly touched upon, because he had a debate recently with an individual, kind of like the Western critical method, and the way I understood it was, some people, like, I don't know if you've ever learn anything about Christian apologetics or anything of that
Not
sort.
much, no.
Not much, too much, right? Because you mentioned your friends with Muhammad Hijab.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I'm not friends with Muhammad, but I know Muhammad, and I've seen what Muhammad does.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's a better practitioner in the way he does things than myself.
Right.
But in terms of the historical critical method, I mean, as a historian, we go through this methodology, right?
Right.
Which is the idea that you look at particular sources in a way in which it's an ingrained assumption that, okay, first you remove religion or spirituality or Allah Ta'ala from the subject.
Right.
And that's the objective way to look at something.
Right.
And then you examine these sources in a particular way in which you have the right to criticize them based on when they were written, how they were written, when they came from, and so forth.
Right.
And by removing, the assumption of biases that a particular religious group might have, i.e. Muslims, by removing Allah because that's a bias, you then present yourself as being objective by saying that, I have a right to speak about this because my methodology tells me that this is an objective way of looking at something, and it's the right way of looking at something. This is the correct way of looking at something.
That's a bias inherently there.
Exactly.
Right.
And so what you realize then is that the secular methodology, in the way it speaks of religion, is not devoid of biases.
Right.
It's actually policing religion from the inception. Right. And so then it speaks of religion in a particular way, and it doesn't allow the religious sources to be able to present itself in accordance to its own tradition.
Sure.
Not realizing that the tradition of Islam itself is very robust. Mm-hmm. So for hadith literature, for example, the idea that there can be one hadith that's weak and this, that, the other, the assumption is made, see, if there's one hadith that's weak, hadiths are weak.
Right.
We have scholars who recognize this. We've gone through this. We are robust we have categorizations regarding hadith and so forth, right?
Right.
They try to compare Quran with the Bible in terms of, but the books are different. The Quran was an orally recited tradition.
Right.
And when they're looking at parchments, and they're saying, see, that someone's put a mistake here.
Right.
You're saying, but that doesn't go against the way that the Quran is recited by all people across So these are the things that you see where they look for these particular things from their perspective, not understanding that actually on many occasions the secular tradition facilitates a particular assumption, is built on a particular assumption in the way that religion is looked at.
Right.
And as a result, it then critiques that religion from that perspective.
Right. You give an example where you would say Allah says in the Quran, and your advisor says, no, the Quran says.
Yeah.
But they do the same thing with the Bible. They say the Bible says.
Yeah.
The Christians will say the Bible says this, the Bible says that.
Yeah.
You know, like preacher.
Yeah.
So maybe do you think that's intentional? It's not just a custom of how they talk about religious texts.
Yeah, but it dislocates the religious text. It dislocates
because the system is built like that.
That's
way.
Right.
Okay.
So in essence, the religious text doesn't speak in the way that it should be spoken of.
Right.
Right. So here in the case of the Quran, when you take away the idea that Allah Ta'ala has written the Quran,
right,
we're just going to look at it independently.
Right.
In that context, it dislocates the Muslim from the book.
Right. So this is my case study that I want to entertain.
Yeah.
You've got because this methodology, taken away from academia, a lot of it has kind of stepped into our own worldview and paradigm. The average Joe, average American, average Brit, right? Yeah. They're skeptical by default, especially as we move away from religion, right? So let's say you've got somebody who is, from a Christian background,
right,
but no longer says he believes in science, doesn't because, he knows all the stuff about Christianity, the Bible,
right,
that, because even the most, he looked into the Bible and he's like, even the most conservative Christian can't really tell you for sure that Mark wrote Mark.
Yeah.
And the more ijma, so to speak, is that the Gospels are anonymous. So you've got all these collections of books, right?
Yeah.
So now he knows nothing about Islam or the Quran. But if he's introduced to a religion, you now have to introduce him to the Quran. Yeah. Right? That's his gateway. Because I think he's from a point of view like, listen, I don't care about theology or Jesus saved me and all that stuff. I want to look at what I have, which is the Bible. Yeah. The Bible fell apart for him because of how their method is used. Yeah. So now he's trying to use that similar method to the Quran. And my theory, and I thought about this, is that like he's a materialist. So his best case scenario is going to be something of the lines of, if he does his research, he's like, well, most likely the most probable cause is that the Prophet Muhammad wrote the Quran, right?
Right.
Which already puts it at a different level than the Bible, like higher up, because now you don't. Number one, now could he make an argument that it's anonymous? Because but now you're creating scenarios.
Right, that's right.
You know what I'm saying? Or, although you could think about it this way, that you can be like, okay, Mecca, certain verses are, because the way they look at the Bible is that like, the way, they were like, oh, this looked like it was written by the author of Luke. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so someone might look at that way, like, okay, these verses are this and this and that, right? But when you think about it, and you can date the Quran, so a materialist will find that you can date the Quran back to the 1st century of Islam, right? Yep. You can't do that with the Bible.
That's right.
And maybe his only other scenario is that historically you could find out, okay, maybe there's Sahaba that wrote the Quran. Yeah. That's the only other scenario, right? At some point, we know Hidayah comes from Allah, right? Because the idea that the angel Jibril alayhi salam revealed what was in the tablet to the Prophet alayhi salam, and then it became the Quran.
Right, that's right.
Is a supernatural belief, right? That requires some level of faith. Yeah. But like logically, how do we get some person? Because I think you can get the material side. We'll get them already way past Christianity, right? And now I think it requires you just have to get them there. But maybe it's a thing of like that person needs to want something internally to get there.
So generally, like most people who have these sort of like interest in Islam or conversion stories, they go for a particular emotional experience. Actually,
right? Very
few go for this intellectual experience, even though they may profess that. But if we are going to go down the intellectual side,
right,
the first question is the existence of a creator. Because only then, once we've established that there is a creator, can we then come to the question that the Quran is the word of that creator. So, for example, is there a creator? Yes or no? Let's go through the argument.
Right.
Now, if there's a creator, how is the creator communicating with you? Right. Would he communicate with you or leave you to your own devices? He is communicating with you. We make the claim that the creator is communicating with you via this book, in this book, the argument has been made to make one verse like this or so forth and so on.
Right.
And so then you break it down in that sense as a way. So in that sense, you don't need the Quran to understand the existence of Allah Ta'ala, firstly, in that sense. But you need to understand the existence of Allah Ta'ala to appreciate the Quran, right? So that could be one particular way of going about it, depending on what the person is like. And then once you get to that point, you make the arguments of how this was an orally transmitted book.
Right.
And you could make comparisons between the hadith of Rasul Sallam and the Quran. You see the way that Rasul Sallam's language and style is improving as he's going along. And yet the Quran is very consistent in the way that it's written.
Right.
In that context. You can make umpteen historical arguments about how this was revealed over 23 years and it's maintained this level of consistency. Right. And so on. You can then look at how the Quran is a linguistic miracle.
Right.
Because I think some people cannot understand the idea when we say it's a linguistic miracle. They say, what does that mean?
Yeah.
But then you know, style meaning grammar. You give them these arguments in that sense. So in that sense, our tradition is very robust.
Right.
Because the Quran is very robust. And the Quran, keep saying this, is not the Bible. The Bible has a very different tradition.
Right.
Which is particular people heard Isa alayhi salam for them say certain things, they annotated, note them down, translated them, and so on. Whereas the Quran remains very consistent in the way it's collected. We are very consistent in our narrative in the collection of the Quran. The styles of recitation of the Quran. And the fact that when the Quran was written, what the methodology was. Any criticism that they have in regards to the collation of the Quran is because we've given them the information in the first place. We were the ones who were telling them, Uthman bin Affan had this Qur'ans removed, burnt these copies that were made and so on. So they are dependent on our tradition to understand what our tradition is. For them to take it from us and then sort of like just say, well, everything they're saying is nonsense. Doesn't make sense. So they're being inconsistent in that sense.
Well, yeah. Cause, I mean, the conversation, my avatar here is with an actual like average American who's willing to actually have a sincere conversation. Right? Not like some polemicist, not someone who's going to like, because those conversations are pointless, right? But you'll often run into people in your course of life, I mean, people are converting to Islam in masses, right? So they're out there and people are looking. And sometimes, like, people will, like, come across something, it'll intrigue them. They'll ask you questions about it. And I think we just need to be equipped to answer those questions. And just kind of walk them through the process.
And what's interesting is, as you said, walk them through the process. That's exactly what you do. You create relationships with people. You help them through the process. It's very possible that a particular given individual may not know all the information about this particular moment. They can then take them over to somebody else. And in the community, the wisdom is in the collective. There is always somebody in the community who will be able to explain the idea in the way they see fit. What it requires on the other side is a level of sincerity. So I've had Christian students who've done student exchanges in my classroom where I've been teaching about Syria. And, I as an historian tell them that openly to my students that while they're there, that this is a contentious point in Syria. The evidences are this like this in Syria. But when we get to the Quran, we say, that the claim is made in Islamic history that if you are sincere, that this is the word of Allah, which is an outrageous claim to make. It's a bombastic claim to make, but we make it. We say that these are his words verbatim, and that this is the way that he communicates to you, and that his messenger was the medium in which the communication was made. Now, if you're sincere, you will try to investigate these claims. If you are sincere. If you're not, if you want to believe in something, and I'm now telling you these things, then the least you can do is try to find out if this is the case. I'm not telling you to do this over 5 minutes. Take your time. We got all the time in the world. I'm not concerned about that. In that sense, I'm not. We're not going out there to convert people. In the end of the day, we just believe that this is the truth, and this will bring people's salvation.
And I think some brothers sometimes are like, well, we got to get a quick conversion. What if he gets hit by a car? But I'm like, listen,
that's not in your hands. Once the process has begun, Allah Ta'ala knows the intention. Let Allah deal with that. And this is what I keep telling people about, like, when people ask me, we need to defend Islam. So you don't need to defend Islam. There's a sense of hubris when we say that. Islam will defend itself. It's a deen of Allah. Yani, you let it be. We need Islam for our own salvation. As a Muslim, I need Islam. So to then go around and say, I'm going to defend it. I just find that a bit problematic. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
So we have to take a step back a little bit and let people go through their journeys. Give them the information, knowledge, be there for them. Be very mature in the way that we do it, and then support people while they're going through their journeys,
Right.
then bring them into the community so that we can protect that,
Right.
help them through it, let them get knowledgeable, and then so on.
I think that's a great way to wrap up this podcast.
Thank you
Dr.
very much.
Yakoob, it's been a pleasure to have
Thanks
you.
for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Where can people find out more about? Like, I know you're not on. We talk. You avoid like social media and all that stuff.
So I came on Twitter last month because I was asked to go on Twitter when I'm finding it like just the Wild West to some degree.
Right.
I'm a recluse. This is the problem. So when people ask me or they try to critique me in terms of saying, we don't find your publications and
Right.
you're not famous and so forth,
Right.
because I don't want to be famous. But I told you this before, that people have been asking me my opinion about certain things. I'm just giving my humble opinion. If there's an expert out there
Yeah.
that people feel more comfortable listening to
Right.
and are not happy with what I have to say, I have no problem with that.
Right.
But I am becoming more and more visible
Right.
just based on the fact that people want to learn Islamic history.
Right.
And so I'm trying to give my time as a way of teaching Islamic history in the hope that better people than me in the community will kick on from that. So I make the argument, I don't want people to be like me. I want them to be better than me because we need that. We
You
deserve it.
mentioned you do have students over Zoom. If
Yeah.
you are taking a cohort of students, like where would they find that information out?
So I have an email address,
Okay.
or they can just send me, now that I'm on Twitter, they can just send me a tweet.
Okay.
I haven't taught online for a while
Okay.
because even then I feel a bit uncomfortable teaching on Zoom, but I realize that more and more people want to learn. This is an avenue that we can do. Generally, there are people who want me to be on their platform and they have a platform of people who want to learn, like today in Chicago where I was
Right.
invited. I'm more than happy to either do it online or turn up if I can physically do that.
Right.
And that's what I'm doing right now.
Would you entertain the option of maybe students even going to Istanbul and doing like, because sometimes people go there for like other retreats for a month
Yeah.
and like maybe pinging you for some sessions, that kind of thing?
So yeah, I've said to people all the time, so while I'm a recluse, I'm still quite accessible.
Okay.
So people come to Istanbul all the time, and I give them time of day. Now, if people want to come and have if they've come on a holiday or something, and I can give them the time,
Yeah.
and they want to have a small session, we can do that. It's not
Right.
a problem.
Okay.
But it all comes down to time, and then people. This is going to sound really strange, accepting that I'm just an uber introvert, and my social battery really runs out really quickly. So long as they give me that time,
I mean,
I'm more than happy.
well, you got to know about Liverpool.
Yeah, that is
Yeah,
true.
Michael. I mean, because like I started talking about football with you.
Yeah.
You mentioned it in the class, and people were like, "You said soccer," and everyone just kind of like, "Yeah, whatever."
Yeah.
They were like, nobody, really
Yeah.
got along with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I used to watch football a lot.
And it sound like you're a gamer too.
Yes, I am a gamer. I watch anime. I watch The Mandalorian. I watch popular culture. I pay attention to that. I play sports, and I think, I know you want to wrap up, but what was interesting is certain young people now, I found that they like seeing their scholars as regular human beings.
They're relatable.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to be relatable. I'm just a regular person. You know what I
Right.
mean? And like when we spoke in the beginning about my journey,
Yeah.
like I'm not a sheikh or an alim or something.
Right.
I've learned knowledge in the vicinity of great men and great
Right.
women in that
Right.
sense, right? But they've shaped me in terms of who I am. But I'm just this regular guy who's learned how to teach history, and it means a lot to me. And I want the community to kick on and do something for themselves.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, again, it was great to have you.
Thank you very much.
For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at info@sultansandsneakers.com.
I love that name, by the way.
Sultans and
That
Sneakers.
is amazing. Yeah.
When I thought about it, was like I was in the garage taking the trash out,
Right.
and I just like the name,
Yeah.
and I was just like, because I'm tired of like, some of these Muslim podcasts have like really like cliche names,
Right.
and I'm just like, I didn't want that. I'm like,
Yeah.
people are like, what does that mean? I don't get the topic.
Yeah.
I'm like, you don't need to,
Yeah.
because there is a philosophy out there that
Right.
you don't need to have your title of the podcast should have
Yeah.
nothing to do, but.
Right.
A lot of it is about my own brand. Like, okay,
Right.
so I'm sold because I'm into like, I'm not so much anymore as a sneakerhead, but I've
Right.
got like 70 pairs of sneakers.
Oh wow. Okay, that's really cool.
I'll actually like your next ride gets here, I'll take you to my basement to show you my
That'd be
sneaker
fantastic.
collection
Really
real quick.
cool. Thanks for that.
My wife's gonna get pissed, but she's not home yet, so it's all good. Not a lot of people get to see that collection, at least part of it.
Well, thanks a lot.
And then the whole Sultan, this idea of like being tied to tradition,
Right.
because that's how I look at myself.
Right.
From an identity point of view,
Right.
religiously,
Right.
like I'm very like if people like like I don't consider myself a progressive as far as Islam goes. I
right.
consider myself like a traditionalist
Right.
in that sense. I went from like a Salafi dawah more to like the tradition, like the
Right.
pro-tasawwuf,
Yeah.
madhab based
Right.
approach to Islam. So,
Well, can I just say then that thanks a lot for having me on the podcast, because like I said, I really do appreciate the sort of respect and time and energy you've given to me. And I'm really appreciative of you giving me this moment to just express some of my thoughts, opinions, and ideas.
Well, yeah, no, it was a great. This was a fun show.
Thank you.
And I don't know how you're doing it with this, with the energy level. With the
good,
jet lag and everything. And,
it's okay.
Well, jet lag probably is over from Turkey right
That's
now.
right. Yeah.
Because you've been in Jersey and whatnot.
Yeah.
So you definitely reach out to me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And for my special guest, Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, I'm your host, Mahin the Podcaster, signing off. Assalamu alaikum.